Conspirinormal.
Okay, welcome guys to Conspirinormal. It's your host Adam, and Surfiel is working on a music project right now, and he will be back next week. But joining me tonight is Professor WHAM. And we had Professor WHAM on all the way back, I think it was in January, I'm pretty sure. So it hasn't been that too long ago. But Professor WHAM is rejoining us tonight to talk about some things that happened in your past, Professor WHAM, like an experience of actually knowing a serial killer. And we're gonna kind of get into the weeds on this. So the serial killer in question is Robert Berdella.
It's Berdella. No.
Berdella.
Berdella,
okay.
Yeah.
He was known as the Kansas City Butcher, also known as the Collector. I'm just reading this from the Book of Knowledge Wikipedia page. And he apparently was kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 men between 1984 and 1987 in Kansas City, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
I read an article that you sent to me about him, and it's some pretty gruesome stuff. It's extremely bad.
Yeah.
So I guess let's talk about like what kind of like the details of his crimes, what it was that he did, and then we'll kind of get into how you actually knew this person.
Okay. Well, it's actually the details of the crimes that I don't like to talk about that much, but because it's very upsetting. But
it is indeed.
He. The way I try to describe him to people is think of him as sort of a Jeffrey Dahmer on steroids. And what I mean by that is that he would capture some of his victims. And what's interesting about his victims is that in most cases, when you have a sexual sadist, because that's what he was,
right.
In most cases, when you have a sexual sadist, you have an individual who is preying on individuals who are weaker or smaller than they are, or younger, men on women, or, or men on, or, adults on young people, that kind of thing. And with the exception of one person, all of his known victims, and there may be some others that we don't know about, this was always implied, but the ones that they have evidence for and that he admitted to, all of them were adult males that were, in their late 20s, early 30s. So and he wasn't a big man. I mean, he was kind of overweight a little bit, but he wasn't like a huge person. And so he had to find ways of subduing them and maintaining control over them as adults. And so what he did was he used drugs. He used a lot of different drugs, a lot of controlled substances that were actually very difficult to get. And it was through drugs and kind of a systematic torture over time that he gained control over people. And he would keep them alive for a long time and do this. And in fact, my understanding is that his first two victims died of their injuries. He did not actually kill them. And then one guy he did finally kill, mostly because they were sort of in his way. He didn't want he didn't want a contractor who was coming to house to find him, to deal with him. So he just like tied a plastic bag over his head and let him die. But I mean, the kinds of things that he did, and the Wikipedia article is really very, it's not very detailed in terms of
Right.
what he did. There is one, I mean, for people who are really into this sort of thing, which I'm not actually, there is one true crime book that has been written by him called Buried Rights. It's Rites.
This was written by him?
No, it's written about him.
About him, okay.
And I will say it's poorly written. It was written in the middle 90s. It evinces, I mean, if you read it now, it evinces I don't even know if it's still in print actually, but it evinces a really kind of unfortunate, bizarre paranoia about gay people generally, which is kind of unfortunate to read now, when you're reading it.
Sure.
And also the author.
As if and somehow like all gay people are serial murderers or something.
Yeah, or something. I mean, there's just even without that. I mean, there are some gross stereotypes about the gay community generally, and also gross stereotypes about occultism and about witchcraft and things like this. The thing to remember about when Bob Berdella was caught, or when he, which was 1988 or 1989, it was right at the beginning of what would become the witch craze thing. And, it actually peaked in the early 90s, but
Satanic Panic.
The Satanic Panic was just beginning in the late 80s. And Bob had amassed one of the largest collections. I think it was at one time appraised at like the 5th largest collection of antiquities in the country, in North America at the time. And so his house was just stuffed with all of this weird crap, like from Tibet and from India and from, much of it stolen, indigenous stuff that had been stolen. But because of all the weird crap that he had in his house, the police at the time just made the assumption that he was into satanic stuff or whatever, and he wasn't. He liked weird stuff, but he in my experience of him, he was not into anything. In fact, I asked him once, what sign were you born under? What astrological sign? He goes, oh, I was born under the money sign. That's what he said. So, he was not like into spiritual stuff at all.
Yeah, he wasn't into like New Age. He had a shop. I understand, like it was like Bob's Bazaar.
Right.
Was the name of it? Yeah.
And they sold all kinds of things in it, and it was in a flea market. But anyway, so let me to finish about what he did. So if you want to know the details of what he did, that book has some details in it because it reproduces some of his diaries. He kept copious diaries and journals in which he recorded everything that he did to every single person, and like minutely. And so if for people who have that kind of weird prurient interest, you can kind of check that out.
Well, there's a lot of that. I mean, a lot of people are really into true crime. I mean, I'm pretty into it myself. I mean, the whole serial killer thing kind of fascinates me as well. It makes you really think about just like how does somebody like, get to that point? Somebody like him, it's a pretty fascinating thing, but you can't dwell on it too much because it's some pretty dark stuff. Right.
And to be clear, he was not a cannibal. I mean, he
wasn't like Dahmer.
He was not like Dahmer in that way. He did not, I mean, what I was able to determine later on, and this was later on, obviously, after reading this book and just, thinking about it and, even talking to him a couple times while he was in prison and, stuff like that, what I was able to figure out was that the killing part was not something that he was that into. It was the torturing part at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes, in a sense, and this sounds so awful, but sometimes, people died as a result of that. And sometimes they had to be killed, as a result of that. But then the other part of it, although this was the more strenuous part of it, the other part of it was disposing of the bodies and kind of pulling it over on the police, because he hated the police. He hated the police. And there were some actual good reasons for his dislike of the police in Kansas City at the time. But he, as a gay man, and also just, the other thing that people have to remember is at the time when he committed these crimes, when they initially arrested him, they held him for sodomy because they had to prove everything else. And at the time in Missouri, they didn't always obviously, enforce this law, but simple sodomy, which was gay sex, essentially, simple sodomy could get you 15 years in the state penitentiary. So that's kind of the nature of sort of the politics, the sexual politics, that existed with the police at the time. And he had been a minor, earlier in his life when he had first come to Kansas City. He had sort of dabbled in a minor way with certain types of drug trafficking. So, he was known to the police for that. And because he had connections to the police department, he was also aware of their corruptions. And at the time, I don't know how the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department is now, but at the time, it was a fairly corrupt institution. There was no independent oversight of them at all. They sort of operated as an independent government agency. And they were known for the brutality, and they were known for their racism and for their homophobia and for their participation in drug and human trafficking from time to time. There's certain members, obviously not the whole force, but so there was corruption within the police department, and so he detested them. He considered them all to be hypocrites. And so if he could like commit this crime and then dispose of the bodies in the way he did, which was to cut them up and put them in garbage bags over a period of several weeks, not all at once even, but over a period of several weeks, so that the bodies would never be found, except for those parts that he kept in the house and buried in his backyard. I'm laughing because it's so gross, not because
Right.
I think it's funny. But his ability to pull that over, the eyes of the police, that was the other way in which he kind of got a thrill, I think. But the actual killing of people, I don't think that, from what I can tell, that's not what thrilled him.
Yeah. It was a sexual sadist kind of thing. And,
Yeah.
and kind of like having like having one up on the police. And this is all going on at the same time. I mean, not too far from Kansas City, is the BTK killings are going on all around at the same time. And, Dennis Rader was very much that same kind of personality.
Yeah. I mean, in the sense that, he, although he was more of a stalker. Berdella was more of an opportunist. He didn't go out actually looking for victims. Victims would sort of come to him, and they would, and in fact, the book talks about this, and he talked about this in some of his interviews, that people would come to his house, and then it would just occur to him, oh, this is somebody I could do this with, or whatever. And not everybody that he dated or that he saw or brought home did he do this with.
I mean, did he have any steady relationships with any other men? I mean, did he have like a boyfriend or anything that was like
not that I ever knew?
Yeah.
Not that I ever knew. In fact, the thing that has always stuck with me is that the day before he was arrested, and this is, I was talking to you earlier, I think that on some level he set up the last thing that he did to sort of maybe be caught. But the day before he was arrested, I was working at this place where I had a part-time job. I had started back to school to eventually get my graduate degrees. And I was working at this part-time place in Kansas City, Missouri. And I worked as kind of like the office manager.
you've been to a lot of places in your life, Professor Wham.
Oh, I grew up part of my life in Kansas City. So,
Yeah. We were talking about you lived in Chattanooga, where I was from.
oh
Too,
yeah,
so,
that was when I was young. Yeah,
yeah,
when I was a little kid. But this is when I was an adult, and his boss, my boss, there at the job where I was working, had his power of attorney and was also a business partner of his on certain things, management consultant and things like that. And so Bob would come by, like maybe twice a month, and they would talk about legal stuff and business plans, and Harold always did his taxes and stuff like that. Well, anyway, the day before he was arrested, he came in, and I was there at the front desk, and he had an appointment with my boss, but he had to wait a little bit because my boss was always talking to somebody. I remember he was talking on the phone, and so there was always like 10 minutes or so that you had to wait. And so anyway, I was talking to Bob, and Bob started telling me he started saying, yeah, I'd heard that you had gotten a cold and I was really concerned about you. And he had brought me some over-the-counter like medication, which I didn't take because I actually didn't need it because I had my own, but he had like brought me some medicine, and he said, and I just really, at one point he said, I just always have really wanted to tell you that I've always considered you to be one of my best friends, which was weird because it was like, I didn't know Bob had friends. In my mind, I thought, really? And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He says, I've always sort of been able to talk to you about, things that mattered to me, like, my beads and my relationships. And I guess we had, when I worked for him, I guess we had sort of, talked about that stuff. But for me, we had talked about it on a very surface level, so.
Making small talk kind of thing.
Yeah, making small talk,
right,
So,
right.
but apparently for him, those were important conversations. So, so it was just really weird because he said that which was on a Friday, the next day, which is a Saturday, which is when I usually worked for him when I did, I decided that I would go in and see him because I hadn't been to the store for a while. And so I went in, and I went in about 11:30, and he was renting space to a young jeweler, another artist at the time that was sort of in the same shop area, but he was like renting a part of the shop area for himself. Now he's an established jeweler somewhere, but and I walked in. His name was Russ, and I walked in, and Russ said, is it possible that you could like man the front for a little bit because Bob left for lunch and he's never come back?
Okay.
And I was like, okay. And so I did for about an hour, but then I had to go because I had planned to work. Right. So I said, Russ, I really got to go. I can't. So Russ was like, okay, fine. I'll try to figure out how to do this myself. And so I left, and 15 minutes later, the place was raided by the police. They were shutting his store down, and everybody that was there, all the Russ and all the customers, they rounded them all up and took them to the police station. And so I missed that by like 15 minutes. Well, what had happened was his last victim had gotten loose and gotten out of his house.
Yeah, I had read that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And what they had done, and he had gone to a neighbor, and his neighbor had called the police, and then the police called Bob at the store and said, we can either arrest you in your store in front of all your customers, or you can come home and be arrested here.
Wow.
So that was before they like dug up the backyard and stuff. So
yeah, apparently they had set up a task force. I guess that had investigated him. That's what I'm seeing on the on the wiki page.
Yeah, well, he was suspected in the disappearance of a couple people.
Yeah,
and that's what I mean. It's like, it's we don't really know. I mean, part of the conversation that I had with the police later on, because I mentioned to you earlier that I was never actually interrogated by the police as such about it, but because there were a couple of other people who knew me and who were business partners of him, who had known him, who intervened on my behalf. I don't know why, but they just did. But the police obviously wanted to talk to me too, because I had known him for almost a decade in various places, around town. And I'd worked for him, and I'd been in his house once. And, so I knew him.
Wow.
And yeah. And so obviously they wanted to talk to me. So after he had confessed and everything, and I think he was in prison actually by that time, because it didn't take them too long to do all of that.
Right.
Because he confessed. But a policeman came over to my apartment and sat and talked to me for about an hour and a half. And it was just a weird interview. I mean, it was not about the crimes that Bob had committed. First of all, he brought Bob also took photos of all of his victims.
Yeah.
At various stages of their victimness, and
wow.
and also of them being dead and stuff. And there were several photos in the pile of photos that they found that were obviously taken by third parties, that Bob was in the photo, but the way in which the photo was done, there had to have been other people present. Okay. Uh-huh. So, and there were other photos of people, there was at least one photo or several photos of one person that appeared to possibly be dead. They couldn't tell for sure, because you can't tell for sure, but appeared to possibly be dead, but he was not any of the people that had been identified. And he was not one of the people that was missing.
Did they later identify him?
They've never identified him.
Oh shit! Wow.
But anyway, so this policeman brought some of these photos, which you're not actually supposed to, those were like evidence photos. So he brought some of this stuff to my house, which I really didn't appreciate looking at. And he was asking me questions that at the time didn't make any sense, but now, later on, I figured out were clearly about, he was trying to establish whether or not whether I knew whether or not Bob was part of a larger ring of people, like a sadomasochistic ring of people that may have been involved in murder, or that especially they were interested in where he got some of the drugs that he used, because some of the drugs are controlled substances. They were very difficult to get. Some of them could only be administered intravenously or with a hypodermic needle. They're not the kind of thing that you can get off the street.
What are we talking about? Like what kind of drugs?
Well, there's certain types of certain kind of tranquilizers, certain types of tranquilizers, sedatives, and at this time, by the way, this was right during the same time periods, like the spring of 1988 or something like that. It's right during the time period when the trials for the Franklin scandal, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, were just kind of peaking then. And so there was this, and that was in Omaha, so that's not very far. And for those people who know,
no, not at all.
Those people who know about the drug hubs in the Midwest, they know that there is a direct pipeline between Omaha and Kansas City, and then further places up north. So Omaha is like a distribution point from Kansas City, even more than St. Louis, from Kansas City to up through the northern plains, that goes up into the northern plains from Omaha. So Omaha is like, at least at the time, was like a central drug hub. And so I think he was trying to determine whether Bob was connected to the drug trafficking angle of the Franklin scandal or not.
I bet he must have had some kind of tangential thing to do with it. You would almost think that he probably would.
He had to have known about it. And the reason I say that is because there's evidence. I mean, when we talk more about the Franklin scandal, I can talk a little bit more about this, but there is evidence that even I was aware of in my small capacity early in the 1980s, when I lived on the street for a while before I got my life together. I was aware of human and drug trafficking activity that was happening in the part of Kansas City that I was living in, because I was specifically warned by people on the street that I knew, and also by people that were coming out of this one mental health institution, which, by the way, was shut down. It was a county state institution. But there were people in that institution who, when they came out, and I knew of them from, I had some drug and alcohol problems of my own at the time, but they were very specific about warning me away from certain places. Because this type of trafficking was known to occur there. And I mean, some of those places don't exist anymore. One of them was right off the plaza. The building that this happened, that was pointed out to me, no longer exists. They've torn it down. But so when I found this out about Bob, and that connection, or that possible connection, I was like, the police knew about all this stuff, because even in the early 80s, the police knew about it, and they didn't do anything about it. In fact, some of them participated in it. They didn't do anything about it. And so I'm afraid that I kind of.
That's another aspect. Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the reason why, while as heinous as everything that Bob did, and that Bob was in those in what he did, he was not incorrect about that level of corruption, at all. So, I've just uncovered evidence here and there. It's all very iffy and everything. But anyway, but that sort of evidence always is. It's always, especially when law enforcement is involved in it. I think that probably the thing that convinced me of all of this stuff is, in my later life, I realized, in looking back at evidence that was even right before me, that I did not recognize at the time, because I was naive. I didn't have any I didn't have any firsthand experience of this stuff, so I didn't recognize it when I saw it. But now I know that, for example, one really close friend of mine that I went to high school with, her mother was trafficked. She was an indigenous woman who had been trafficked to her father, and she herself was being set up to be trafficked. I didn't realize this at the time, but now I look back and I see all the signs. I understand now exactly what was going on in that household, because I've had this explained to me by people who have come out of those situations. This is what you see. This is what you look for. These are the kinds of relationships that you will observe. And then, and it would be like, oh my God, that's what was going on here. I mean, it's like, oh my God, and I didn't see it, and I know, and I had another really good friend who has since passed, whose mother trafficked her.
This stuff goes on. I mean, it's a very real thing. And just to kind of just say this, like we've talked a lot about on this show, we've talked a lot about QAnon and what they talk about. And like the thing about QAnon is that like it's based in some form of reality. Like it's total crap, but it's based in a reality that is actually going on,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see how that has been weaponized into QAnon. But the thing is that like this stuff does happen, and it's very, very real. And I mean, it's gone on since the beginning of civilization. I mean, let's just face it. It's horrible.
Well, at least to some degree, certainly.
Mhm.
I mean, obviously now there are ways of doing this on sort of an industrial level,
Right,
you know.
right.
But the whole thing with Bob. I mean, Bob, I think, was connected to it not by his victims, because the victims, for the most part, were older men.
Mhm.
They didn't need to be trafficked. He could find them in various places.
Like you said, he was an opportunist.
He was an opportunist, but I do think that he may have had connection to the drug trafficking part of it, because he was connected to drug trafficking anyway, generally, or because of earlier in his life. And some of the drugs that he used, I don't think he could have gotten any other way, honestly. So, he used to sort of, pride himself. He would always show up, like he would always show up with drugs, like to parties and stuff that no one knew how he got them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, where did you get, and he was always assumed that we wanted to take them, which, I've never been much of a drug taker. So, I've always been, I have more problem with alcohol.
Okay. So you knew him from this place that you worked at, but you actually would go and like hang out with this guy too. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what happened was, where I first met him in the early 80s when I worked at a alternative women's bookstore in Kansas City.
Okay.
Which, of course, among the various alternative communities that it served was the gay community, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And it was there that I met Bob, because Bob would come into the store sometimes. He's a gay man. And so he'd come into the store sometimes, and he had established his store. And so we had like this newsletter that we would put out like twice a month or something. And he would advertise in it. And so, and he had originally been a student at the Kansas City Art Institute. And so he was sort of at least tangentially connected to the alternative kind of art crowd in Kansas City. Like he liked avant-garde art, and he liked jazz, and so he was in those alternative communities, and so that's where I first met him, was in that kind of a context, and then through his store. There were a lot of us who were kind of into like alternative spirituality, and neo-paganism, things like that. Right. And so he had stuff like that that he would sell in the store, that you could go there and you could find cool stuff. And the one thing that he did have at the store that was really cool was, now it's fairly common to be able to go to like hobby stores or exotic stores and get all kinds of really cool beads that you can use to make things, Well, he was one of the first people in Kansas City to do that, to have this whole collection of beads. These were trade beads. These weren't just like glass beads or plastic beads. These were like genuine trade beads from all over the world, from Africa, from Asia, from India, from South America. And you could go and, purchase them and then string them, do whatever you wanted to. I will say he loved trade beads. When he would talk about trade beads, he was a different person. He would go into this other place. His face would change. It was just, I think he really actually genuinely loved whatever these were, and what those meant to him, which was, I think, the ability to be free, to travel, to be in other places other than where he was, maybe he was disassociating. I don't know, but you know, but it was really, the beads were cool. And so we would go and hang out and do that. And so that's how I got to know him over time. And then, you know, sometimes then he would come to parties that friends of mine would have, and yeah, and you know, and sometimes he would come and he would be fine, and sometimes he would become, I remember once he came with this younger kid that I guess he was trying to inculcate in a relationship. Now I don't know that this kid did not end up dead or anything. Okay. You know, I don't know that he actually did anything bad with this kid, but he came and he was on some kind of weird drugs. I don't know what they were, but he was really weird that night. You know, there was this whole kind of weird negative crap that was coming out of him, and we found a way to convince him to leave. But it was one of those situations where you had to be very careful how you did it, because you had the sense that he might get violent. You know, there was this edge.
About how long before he got arrested was this?
Oh, it was several years.
Several years. Okay. So you knew him a rather long time.
I knew him the better part of a decade.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And like I said, in a variety of situations. And then when I went to work for him, which, you know, ironically was during the time when he was killing people. Because I didn't know that at the time, obviously, but when I went to work for him, it was actually a really important thing, because at the time I needed a job. I needed a job really bad. I wanted to try to go back to school, and I had lost a job, which I haven't lost very many jobs in my life, but I was actually fired from this one job, and which actually was fine because I hated it. But I needed a job, and he gave me one, and it was a lifesaver. And he was always, for me at least, I mean, you know, he would go through periods where he was really moody and strange. And I guess I have a high tolerance for strange, but he was always fair. He always paid me what he said he was going to pay me. Sometimes I would take money, and sometimes I would take trade, you know, like.
Okay. So you were working in
his store.
In his store. Okay.
And I would do all the things you do in retail, you know, wait on customers, do displays, categorize things. Like, he always had thousands of these trade beads you had to separate and, you know, sort, and, just stuff like that, just the normal stuff that you do in a retail shop. And we talk, and he did have this habit of talking down to people. He was kind of, if he thought that you were stupid, you know, or he didn't really know what to think of you, he'd sort of talk down to you in a patronizing way, but he never did that with me. I guess if he thought you were smart or something, or he liked you, I just wouldn't do that. There are lots of people that I know now that knew him at various times, and you know, now tell me that they knew that there was something wrong with him, you know, that he just had this dark energy and they didn't like him. Mm-hmm. And you know, I did witness dark energy from time to time, but there also wasn't dark energy there all the time, at least not when I was around him. So, what's weird to me is that I saw him, I guess I see him more as a whole person, the different sides of him. And so when he was arrested, it was very difficult for me to be able to reconcile.
That is what I want to ask, because that's like the big question, is knowing this guy as intimately as you did.
Well, I mean, as intimately as one knows an associate.
Sure. Right. But I mean, you you had parties with this guy, you worked for him, you knew him. I mean, and I think from what you're saying is that like you actually in a way like kind of liked this guy. You thought he was
Aspects of him.
You thought maybe that he was a decent person. And then you find out that this guy is a serial killer and he's done horrible things to people and killed them in horrible ways. It's like, I mean, you're the only person that I can ask this because you're literally the only person that I know that knows a serial killer. It's like, how did you reconcile this?
Well, I don't know that I don't know that I do.
Right.
I think that in the first place, you know, when you find this out about somebody that you know, I mean, I can only imagine what his mother went through.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you find out something like this about someone you know, in a way, you know, if they are a murderer, in a way, they murder themselves too. You know, they murder the person that you thought you knew. And so it's kind of like a death in that sense. And but what happens with the public is that you kind of get, you know, there are lots of victims when someone does something like this. They're the obvious victims, you know, the obvious victims of the victims themselves and then the victims' families, you know, but there's a wider swath of victims, and those are all the people who knew this individual and who maybe had dealings with them, because all of a sudden our reputations are somewhat at question. Some people, not everybody obviously, but some people will say, well, how could you not have known? Because it's a question you ask yourself. How could I not have known? How could I have missed this? Well, the truth is that, you know, serial killers go way out of their way to make sure you don't know. Mm-hmm. That's part of the gig.
Right.
And in his case, he was smart. He was, you know, he was almost a Hannibal Lecter, like smart kind of guy. Yeah. And so he, you know, like not all serial killers are. Some are really sloppy and they're just not like that. But he was smarter. And so he figured out ways of compartmentalizing and keeping things secret, but also keeping himself compartmentalized, you know. But also, if you think about it, you know, we all know some weird people. We all know people who have darkness. We all, you know, especially those of us who are in the paranormal community or in alternative communities, we know, you know, we deal with people who've had lots of trauma of various types.
Yeah, I can absolutely vouch for that. That's for sure.
And so we don't necessarily go around assuming that every dark person we meet is a serial killer. And
Let's hope not.
and God forbid that we ever do.
Right,
you know,
right.
you don't assume that the people that you know are that. And that those are the kinds of things I had to tell myself. I had to realize for myself. And I also decided at a certain point, and I know that this is not something everyone could decide, but it was kind of a spiritual practice for me to do this. I decided at a certain point that because of the fact that I had to talk to him sometimes, because I still worked, you know, at a place where, you know, he called and stuff. I just decided that, you know, I had been his friend as much as he had a friend. You know what I mean? As much as he had any friends, I had been a friend, apparently, because he thought I was. And I decided I was going to remain one, whatever that meant. And not because I agree with anything he did, because I don't at all. In fact, there's one thing I do have to tell you, because this is where your question became very acute for me at a certain point. I decided I would read that true crime book of his, you know, that was written about him that I mentioned. Right. And so I was reading the book. And, you know, like I said, it has portions of it that are part of the diary, you know, that he kept. And so I was reading, and all of a sudden I realized something. while I was reading it, all of a sudden I went through some dates where he had written some stuff down, and I remembered something. I was able to place myself in the diary, because what had happened was, and he describes this at a certain place, I can't remember like what page it's on or anything, but I suddenly remembered that one Saturday I had been working sorting beads, and he had gone to lunch, and he had come back, and he had come back a little bit late. And when he came back, his mood had changed, and he was very sullen. He was kind of he just wouldn't talk anymore, and he was just sort of pulled in on himself, and sort of kind of an asshole, actually, even with customers, and just in a bad mood. And I also noticed that there was this smell that I would occasionally get a whiff of, and I couldn't put my finger on it, what the smell was, even though I recognized it. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, because it was intermittent, and it was just very periodic. You know what I mean? It was just like, and I couldn't remember what it was at the time. But when I was reading the book, and this was several years later, when I was reading the book, all of a sudden I remembered all of that, because what he was describing is how he had gone home from lunch on this particular date, and it was the date. He'd gone home for lunch, and he had difficulty dismembering a body.
Oh my God.
And he had come back, and when I read that, I realized, oh my God, that's what I had smelled.
Jeez.
And I mean, I threw the book across the room. It was just like, I cannot read any more of this book right now, and I just sat there. I sat for a long time, because it was just like, just shuddering, just remembering, because I have smelled dead body before. But it was just so faint at the time that I couldn't,
right.
it didn't. And so I just was like, and so that's when it sort of became very acute for me. I had to sort of just really kind of, how am I going to reconcile this? How am I going to live with this knowledge? Because that's really what it is about. How do you live with this knowledge? Because, you're living with things that you'd prefer not to know. And I realized I didn't know how. I wasn't going to get locked into hatred about a person, anybody. And, I did have a spiritual practice at the time, and I still do. And so I just decided that I would not make a decision about it right then. I would just sort of let myself go through the feelings and the process, just to see sort of where that led. And, it's actually become a really important tool, because I have the ability now to listen to people tell me really awful things, and I can hold it. I can hold it, the awful thing. And I'm talking about either them sharing their trauma, or them telling me. I've had confessions. Pedophiles have given me their confessions.
I'm sure that's something that's just got to weigh on you.
Well, there are ways of releasing it.
Yeah.
Because it isn't mine. It isn't, I am carrying the stories of a whole bunch of people, but they are not my stories, it's not a burden, really. But what it has told me is that there are lots, it's not that, thank God, very few of us actually do what Bob did, thank God. However, the caveat to that is that the impulses that became twisted and perverted in him, the impulse of anger, of wanting to harm someone else, the impulse of revenge, the impulse of thwarted desire, and what that leads to. Lots of us have those issues. So for me, basically, it was like it's become sort of a spiritual practice because there's it's like I told my mom at one point. I said, if any of us need redemption, it's people like him. You know what I mean? I'm not responsible for that redemption at all. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that I don't have to project my fear or disgust or anger towards him because I didn't do those things.
You were just tangentially around it at a certain point.
Right. I mean, I was one of the people, I was one of the other people in his life.
Yeah.
And I was not in his victim profile. So
Correct.
So I was in a different category for him. And apparently I was in a more positive category for him, which is weird, but it's true apparently. So,
I wonder with people like that there is that kind of compartmentalization that is going on, that like he can be a certain person around you, but then around like other gay men or obviously around his victims, he's another type of person completely.
well, another part of him comes out. I mean, we
Yeah.
see this happening in other serial killers. I mean, one of the serial killers that I think of, I can never remember his, Israel Keys. He's kind of a mysterious guy, Israel Keys, because we don't really, because he took a lot of the particulars about his victims to the grave with him. But he, there was one, he had a wife and a child. He had a daughter. And because he had a daughter, he would never pick victims with children.
Yeah. He had sympathy for those people. He identified with those people.
Right. And it's like, the notion that serial killers, because of what they do in one area of their life, that they are, that they have no feelings in other areas of their life is just untrue. I mean, I was talking to my Sufi teacher about this actually last month, and I said one of the things I had to recognize. I mean, we think of people who do these terrible things, we think, oh, they're just like animals or whatever. Animals don't do this, not like this. I mean, animals can, depending on the animal, they can murder or they can torture like their prey. But what human beings do is different.
Right.
It takes a certain kind of focus, a certain kind of an imagination. This is gross, but it's true. And, serial killing in the manner that we think of it now is a peculiarly human thing. It actually requires human faculties to do it. And when you think about it that way, then you're like, oh, it's sort of humbling.
I'm going to ask you this about serial killers. I mean, I'm one of those people that is morbidly fascinated by this stuff. Don't ask me why.
I wasn't until this happened.
Yeah.
I actually wasn't. And after this happened, I went deeply into it and I've researched it because I wanted to understand, I wanted to come to terms with things.
Well, I've talked to some friends of mine that do a podcast called 13 O'Clock, and we're going to have them on here probably in a couple of episodes. But they're talking about how they talk about serial killers, true crime kind of stuff a lot. And, it seems that in recent years, like, serial killing has really kind of dropped. It's not as prevalent as it once was in like probably like the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into that time frame. And I really wonder, just, is there an outlet now with how I'll just go ahead and say it, how ubiquitous porn is, whether or not there's some kind of outlet for some of these guys that they can just get their they can get their jollies off with this, and they don't have to actually act out these crimes or like actually physically kill somebody.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really know what the statistics are. I mean, I would have to do some research with the FBI to find out what they think the actual statistics are. I mean, my understanding is that it varies in terms of that it's more cyclical. It may be that because of the internet and because of the ability of people to access things on the dark web, that it may be that it's possible for people to have more vicarious experiences. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. I think that it just sort of, I think that it sort of depends. I mean, my understanding is that there's at least between 35 and 60 of them present at any given time in North America on average. And that seems to have been true for a while. Now, we don't hear about them quite as much, I don't think. And I don't know why that is. I know that they've become very popular in pop culture, which I find really weird personally. It's like, Jeffrey Pritchett, who I really, who's the host of Church of Mavis, the podcast that I participate on.
Right.
He loves things like Dexter and Hannibal and stuff like that. And I cannot watch that stuff at all for obvious reasons. It's like, I'm sorry.
You knew the real thing.
Yeah, I knew the real thing. This is not entertainment to me. And I think that we're fascinated by the power that we think they have. But what's interesting is that I always experienced, when I thought about Bob's situation, I always experienced him as feeling like he was the victim, that he didn't have power, and that's the reason why he was doing what he was doing.
Yeah.
A way by which to assert power.
So many of them have horrible childhoods, and it seems that he was another one that had, like, an abusive childhood. So many of them have been just like they're so mistreated, and it's something that, like, in that time and age just bred monsters.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he was abused in some ways, but he wasn't, and I would say that he was more emotionally neglected. And which probably was not uncommon for, men of his generation. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't abused at all. And he had one incident that occurred where he was sexually molested by a neighbor, but his family was not abusive. In fact, he disabused. He was like, he refused to say that because he was going to take responsibility for what he did.
I think he knew he was a monster.
Yeah. Oh no, I think he knew he was a monster. But I think that what I'm saying is that he refused to permit his family to be blamed, and to the day of his death, his father insisted on remaining in relationship and insisted on trying to understand him, love him anyway.
Right.
And so I guess that that's kind of what I mean, I can't say that I loved Bob, but I guess I kind of decided the same thing, to remain Bob's friend, because maybe I'm just sort of loyal that way, but also because to quit being his friend is to cut off the possibility of learning. It's to cut off the possibility of figuring out what the lesson surrounding this could be. what different lesson could be derived from the experience and from having this relationship with this person who had done these horrific things. And I wasn't willing to cut myself off. Mm-hmm. So, whatever that makes people think of me, I don't know, but, I can say that I had some really weird kind of paranormal psychic experiences surrounding it, particularly once, in the time period immediately after he was arrested. In the story that I had you read, the short story that I wrote where I kind of talked
Correct.
about this stuff, I describe in that story a ritual that the person, the narrator, conducts in order to try to figure out to figure out the truth about the situation. And that is a brief description of something that I actually did attempt to do right after he had been arrested. At the time, I was working in an occult lodge, and I also was doing neo-pagan stuff, and some Buddhist stuff. And so I decided when he was first arrested, as I mentioned, for sodomy, because sodomy at the time, was illegal in Missouri. And this was before we knew what else he'd been charged with, or what they were going to charge him with. And so I had done this ritual because what I was going to do was try to I was just going to try to go into a light trance and just try to figure out what was really going on. And that's all I was going to do. I wasn't going to try to contact him, or, you know what I mean?
What school of occultism were you drawing upon?
Well, the lodge that I was in was called the Temple Isis Sophia. And it was kind of a cross between Crowley forms, and some Gnostic stuff. So it was kind of there's an author for Llewellyn. His name is Frater Barabbas.
Okay. Yeah.
And
I know the name. Yeah.
And his mundane name is Brian Watling, and I knew Brian when. Okay. So Brian was in Kansas City at the time, and he had started this lodge. And so I was in the lodge. And he and I had also known each other through the pagan community. And so, I had learned a bunch of stuff from him, and I was practicing stuff, and I was just learning meditation and certain kinds of occult practices, some of which I still use, actually, the ritual parts of them. And so I wasn't going to do anything complicated. I was just going to set up a safe space and just, a sphere, and just kind of open a veil a little bit and just kind of get a glimpse of if I could see what was really going on. Because like I said, at the time, I didn't know about all the other charges. There was no way to know this. And what I describe in the book was that I opened the veil, and I can tell you something walked right into the room. And it's really difficult to describe because it's hard to believe, but I did this in broad daylight, and all of a sudden everything got dark in the room. I had natural lighting on, and everything got dark in the room, and it wasn't clouds. And there was this darkness that came in the room, and it got so cold in the room that I could, and this was in April when this happened. The anniversary of his arrest is April 8th. So it was, warmish outside, but it got so cold in the room that I could see my breath. This is true. This really happened. And there was this presence, and it was like this huge darkness, like this pit, this darkness, but there was a presence there. And I could feel his presence, Bob's presence there, like a shadow in front of, kind of silhouetted, if you will, against this darkness in the back. And this darkness was it was almost like it was trying to pull the veil open wider, is what it felt like. was terrifying. I was so scared. Nothing like this had ever happened before, that I was sort of petrified. And I didn't really say anything. I didn't say like, Bob, is this you or whatever. When I heard I heard Bob's voice in my head, and he said, "Shut it down now."
Oh my God.
And I did. I physically sort of, acted like I was shutting the veil, and I just grounded with everything I possibly could, because I'm a very good grounder.
Do you think that there was something attached to Bob?
I think, yeah, I do actually. I mean, I came to the conclusion that he had sort of stumbled into this, that he had started out with, his predilections, his impulses, and that somewhere along the way, he got maybe something that was attached to something that he'd purchased, that was in his house. I don't know. But he had, at some point, he had encountered something or had made a decision to go in a particular direction. Because actually Jeffrey Dahmer talks about this too. In one of his interviews, he talks about this darkness that he encountered in himself, the stranger. Dennis Nilsen talks about this too. Dennis Nilsen is a serial killer from the UK, and how he encountered this darkness in himself that he finally just permitted to take over. Dennis Nilsen said that he was always trying to kill himself, but it was the other person who died. And which is one of the most honest things I've ever heard anybody say. It's also an excuse, but but I do think that there was something there, and I shut it down, and I successfully shut it down. In the story, that character, the narrator, doesn't successfully shut it down, and that's or doesn't know whether they shut it down, and that right. In the story, that's a reflection of the sort of terror, the trauma that I carried with me.
Right. This story was kind of like your way of dealing with this whole situation,
or expressing certain parts of this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Man. Yeah. I wonder about that, and not to say that I don't believe in free will, because I definitely do, and I believe that people can be evil and they can pull these things off, and they are ultimately responsible.
Well, yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, I'm a huge believer that there is this other world, and that it can influence us. And some of these entities are out for blood. I mean, they demand sacrifice.
Well, they're parasitical.
Yeah.
And I do think that if you cross certain thresholds, and torture and murder are among those thresholds. Anger is a threshold. Fear is a threshold. But if you cross certain thresholds, or even sometimes witness the crossing of certain thresholds, so that you know that threshold is there, that the trauma of that, the psychic tearing of that, makes you vulnerable, some people vulnerable, to especially if you don't have any other kind of mooring, like I've had lots of traumas in my life. Obviously this is one, but I've had others too. But one of the things about that I've been fortunate in, and maybe it's just me, I don't know what it is, but I've either had people that have been present that have been able to help me, or I have had a certain kind of spiritual connection at a certain point that has assisted me. But if you don't have those things, if you don't have the support, or the connection, or you don't have a spirituality, something in yourself that, or in others that you can depend on, then I think it leaves you very vulnerable, especially if you're sort of a weak person anyway. And what I mean by that is that I do think there are some personalities that are more prone to this than others. I don't know why. And I'm not trying to say that it's connected to astrology or anything like that. Bob was an Aquarius. Most serial killers are actually mutable signs, which is kind of weird statistically.
What do you mean by that?
A mutable sign is like a Pisces, a Gemini, a Virgo, a Sagittarius.
Okay.
For people who know astrology, they'll know what I'm talking about. But Bob was an Aquarius, which means he was a fixed sign. And there aren't that many serial killers actually that are fixed signs. There have been studies on this actually. Fixed signs tend to be mass murderers. They don't tend, if they're going to murder anybody, if they're going to be violent, they tend to be mass murderers rather than serial killers. But so I don't think it's anything like that. What I mean is that I just think that there are some individuals that for whatever reason, they're more porous than others. And when they do certain types of things, they bring it in more than other people. You know, they're more vulnerable to having attachments or being possessed, you know, whatever you want to call it, being connected, you know. So, you know, I don't know which of these things he was, but I do think that there was something behind what he ended up doing. Because there was one period of time when I had a more extended conversation with him, and he talked a little bit about this, about how he sort of backed into the torture murder stuff. You know, it didn't start all at once. It wasn't like he suddenly had this idea that he was going to do all this. You know what I mean? And it just was something that grew over a period of time. And his first victim, the first guy that died, he didn't kill. The guy died of the torture. He may have had an underlying health condition, in fact, but whatever, he died of the torture. And so then Bob, you know, crossed that threshold into that of having to dispose of the body and having to do all of that. And then it was like, well, what's the next thing? You know what I mean? It sounds really gross, but that's sort of where that stuff leads. It becomes an addiction.
Yes.
You know, it becomes I mean, probably one of the best television shows, if you're going to watch something like this. It doesn't glorify this at all, but Netflix has a series called The Fall, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but
no, I'm not actually.
But Gillian Anderson, who's of course, you know, the goddess of various things. She plays the principal detective who is hunting a serial killer. Now, I will tell you, it's a brutal show. There were parts of it that were really hard for me to watch. It's pretty explicit. But she's hunting a serial killer who also is a kind of sadosexual serial killer, although he's a little more typical in some ways. But it's not so much about his crimes, although they do delve somewhat into the crimes, obviously. It's about those other parts of him. Because in the instance of this serial killer, he is able to have a double life for a while, kind of like Gary Ridgway had a double life for a while. You know, he has a wife and he has 2 children, and he works as a counselor, as a grief counselor. And because he's known a lot of trauma in his life, he's actually relatively decent as a grief counselor until it all sort of comes to a head. And the other interesting thing about the show is that it's premised in Belfast in Ireland. So you get to see kind of how an entirely different style of law enforcement agency does the investigations. So if you're used to like a real American approach, it's a very different kind of social approach to how you deal with this. So it's kind of interesting that way. But the film, the series does go into the other parts of a serial killer. In other words, it's really trying to get you to see. We seem to see these people as really one-dimensional, summarized entirely by the worst things they did. And there's some logic to that, because that's sort of how they impact the rest of us, right? But that's not all they were.
Right.
And we also have to remember that when we do that, we are making their victims only victims. Their victims were people too.
Right. Yeah, that's the main thing that we have to remember in all of this. That these were people that they lived, and that they died horribly at the hands of somebody that had a bunch of problems.
Yeah, it was fucked up.
Right.
I mean, the whole situation is fucked up. It's a fucked up situation.
Let's get into this in the time that we have left, Professor Wham. I want to talk about the Franklin scandal and the connections between Bob and this, because you do say that there are some connections to that.
Yeah, I mean, there were connections that I was able to figure out over time. And I don't know how, have you talked to your listeners at all about what the Franklin scandal was supposed to have?
I have mentioned it before on probably past episodes. I mean, it's something that I am very aware of. I've watched the documentary that the Discovery Channel basically banned back in the day.
Right.
Well, let me reiterate that the Discovery Channel, they pretty much did not air the documentary about the Franklin scandal.
Right. Well, and see, that to me is part of the interesting issue about this. And what I would encourage your listeners to do, if they, if they're interested in this, is there's a book, excuse me, that's by Nick Bryant called The Franklin Scandal.
Yeah, I'd like to get him on the show. I may approach him about that.
And the reason why it's important to know about this scandal, I mean, there's two main reasons, and I'll just briefly go into each. The first reason why it's important to know about the rumors surrounding the scandal is because, well, first of all, this scandal broke in the late 1980s, and it was connected initially intimately with the collapse of the savings and loan industry in the United States in the late 1980s. And the reason why the scandal even emerged was because there was a savings and loan firm that had a number of outlets in Omaha, Nebraska, that was run by a guy named, ironically, Larry King.
Right.
Not the Larry King of media. This was a different guy. And basically what happened was that Larry King made his money at the savings and loan. At least ostensibly he made it. The savings and loan, project that he had was intended to serve lower income people in Omaha and Nebraska and other parts of the Midwest, specifically members of the African American community, but also just poorer people who would not necessarily have opportunity for banking, in certain rural areas, for example, it would be more difficult for them. And part of the reason why this scandal sort of quote unquote came to life is because of the the savings and loan collapse, because it turned out that many of, if not most, of the savings and loans that that Larry King were running was in fact a fairly elaborate pyramid scheme, and that he had actually built lots and lots of people out of money. Well, it also turns out that he himself was in fact involved in human trafficking and drug trafficking in particular. There was never any dispute about this with regard to him. Okay. But it turned out, and it's entirely too complicated to go into all of it, but it turned out that according to the witnesses, many of whom started out, were initially individuals who were older people, older teenagers or younger adults who had said that they had been trafficked by him, that they were able to trace certain elements or accuse the tracing of certain elements of this sex trafficking and drug trafficking syndicate, essentially, is what it amounted to Boys Town, which was a fairly well-known boys' school in Nebraska, as well as throughout various drug and sex trafficking hubs in the Midwest, and eventually, all the way to Washington. So basically, if you think about QAnon, what QAnon is supposed to be, right? I'll just say this. The Franklin scandal was supposed to be sort of on that level. Now, what is interesting about the Franklin scandal is that a lot of the more wild conspiracy theories surrounding it did get completely out of hand. For example, there were rumors that, of course, you had cannibalism and Satanism and the satanic panic thing and everything like that, and that this was supposed to involve, probably, I don't know, really important members of the Republican Party, and especially the power elite in Omaha, in Nebraska, but also in some other places in Washington, et cetera, sex parties in Washington, stuff like that. In some ways, now that we've heard about QAnon, it all sounds sort of old hat, right? It sounds like the movie Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I believe that QAnon just draws on this material, and they basically weaponize this material.
Right, exactly. Now, if you read Nick Bryant's book on the Franklin scandal, he doesn't necessarily believe the really weird stuff, like about cannibalism and satanic panic and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't necessarily believe that at all. But he does find, I think, convincing evidence. And this evidence, when I was reading this book, I realized that some of the stuff he was saying was similar to some of the questions that policeman was asking me. And, in terms of like times and places and certain kinds of activities, so one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, since Larry King was eventually indicted on obviously, banking fraud and that kind of stuff, but he also did serve time for human and drug trafficking. And then when he served his time, or served a certain amount of time, and then was just sort of released. Now, you tell me, do you really think somebody who's done this in the past is not going to do this again?
Right.
First of all, this is how they make their money, all right? And what Nick Bryant does talk about is, he talks about the various links that he finds between witnesses and certain weird FBI cover-ups that are clearly cover-ups, the disappearing of evidence, And it's not that he thinks like the whole Republican Party is involved or anything like that. I mean, actually, his charges are much more modest, but in some ways more severe. Because what he argues is that all that really happened with the Franklin scandal is that Larry King tapped into a trade in humans and in drugs that has always sort of existed in the American subculture. And there are various sort of low-level syndicates that are involved in this. And it does involve some politicians. It does involve, the FBI is aware of it to a certain degree. It does involve certain elements of law enforcement. You would have to have those players present in order for it to retain any kind of continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And his concern is not that the Franklin scandal, as it blew up so big, was all a hoax, because see, that's what's really, really interesting. If you look up the Wikipedia article about it, and I'll just pull it up right here on my phone. If you just read this about it, it says, the Franklin child prostitution ring allegations began in June 1988 in Omaha, Nebraska, and attracted significant public and political interest until late 1990, when separate state and federal grand juries concluded that the allegations were unfounded and the ring was a carefully crafted hoax.
Mm.
Now, what does that mean? Carefully crafted. What the evidence that Nick Bryant presents in a book that is like almost 500 pages long. And keep in mind, this guy he's not a fly-by-night person. He has dedicated his life, his investigative life, to unveiling various, and work with law enforcement to unveil various components of human sex trafficking, drug trafficking, disadvantaged children. He's been published in the Journal of Professional Ethics, the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, the Journal of Social Distress and Homelessness. I mean, he's actually very well known in the areas of trying with the organizations that are trying to expose and get rid of human trafficking, children trafficking. So he's not like some crazy conspiracy wonk, right? But he actually argues that he wonders whether the scandal itself, not the human and drug trafficking, but the blowing up of it into, this carefully crafted hoax, that hoax part of it was a disinformation ploy. He actually questions whether this was not the whole thing wasn't the rumors surrounding it were not actually a black ops of some kind, mm-hmm. To cover up something that was really going on. And the evidence that he assembles is pretty extraordinary. I mean, it's like 500 pages worth. And he talks about where the FBI has stymied him. And he's run into a lot of the same roadblocks that, those of us who try to do research into paranormal stuff run into all the time.
Sure. Which
is one thing that's really weird, and what is interesting too is that this is like one sort of large scale scandal or conspiracy in American culture that somehow someone somewhere has successfully managed to keep media from talking about. And, media will talk about these things all the time. I mean, even the Discovery documentary that you were talking about, at the very least, they could say, well, there was this, because we've had documentaries on the Satanic Panic. So they could say, at the very least, they could say, oh, there was this crazy conspiracy that blew up and it happened in the late 1980s and it happened to do with this. But it was later proven to be, you know what I mean? They could do that, but they don't. They don't talk about it at all. And the reason, part of the reason that has always sort of interested me is because the story about, everybody is like really fascinated, like you said, in our culture with serial killers, but nobody talks about Bob Berdella. Bob Berdella is just not talked about.
Yeah, he's one that I have not really heard about. Yeah.
He is not talked about, and I do not know whether this is true. There's no way for me to verify this, okay? But this is a persistent rumor that I heard in the year or two afterwards, and I heard this rumor. I did hear this rumor from a couple of decent sources. Like one of the sources I heard this rumor from was someone who worked as an assistant for the DA in Jackson County. So it's not like, they were just stupid on the street rumors, right? But I heard a rumor that there was a reporter who had come into town and wanted to do an investigative series of reports on Berdella and wanted to try to do research specifically on the drug trafficking angle that he was connected to, because she had uncovered some interesting evidence. And I've always wondered whether this had to do with the Franklin scandal, because it was during that same time period. And that she assembled quite a bit of information, including from a couple of informants from the police department in Kansas City, Missouri. And then all of a sudden, she literally like burned her notes and left town. Mm-hmm. She just disappeared. And, like I said, I have no first person verification of this, but I heard this story from a decent source and, somebody that I basically trust. So, I don't know what to think about that. It's kind of like there's a whole bunch of stuff here that nobody's talking about. And which means that if there is a conspiracy or a syndicate or whatever that's there, it's still there. It's still going on.
Yeah, it very well might be. There are things about the Franklin cover-up that is wide reaching. I don't know if you have seen the documentary Who Took Johnny Gosch. Have you seen that documentary?
I have not. Who took Johnny? Okay.
Johnny Gosch, Gosch. That is a very good one to watch, because it actually is about this paper boy that at the age of 12 or 13 is abducted. And the mother believes that it gets all tied in with the Franklin cover-up scandal. Okay. And he was actually abducted from West Des Moines, Iowa, which, if you do the distance between that and Omaha.
It's very close.
It's very close. Kansas City is very close. It's all very close. So, there was this kid that was involved, and Bryant mentions him in this interview that you had sent me. I can't remember his name, but he apparently testified, and the judge actually upheld his testimony, and he testified that Johnny Gosch actually was part of the whole was actually part of the Franklin cover-up, that he was one of these kids that was trafficked. Right. And all this, I think, is real stuff. It's hard because I think that like the Pizzagate stuff and the QAnon stuff has just really, really just like poisoned the water.
No, I agree. I think that, My understanding is that the original QAnon stuff, I mean, the guy who's doing the QAnon stuff now is not the guy who started it. And I don't remember who the first guy was, that, where QAnon first began, because that's been actually several years ago. I think that, QAnon actually began prior to Trump and just became associated.
Well, it stems out of Pizzagate, and it's basically a LARP. It's a live action role play.
Right. Right.
It's the same kind of thing that like Joseph Matheny was doing with Ong's Hat and John Teeter back in the day. It's the same stuff.
Right. And it's the thing about QAnon is that the QAnon and the weaponization, as you say, of QAnon has made it very, very difficult for people who actually do attempt to liberate people from these syndicates, who actually are trying to really solve the problem of human trafficking.
Yeah, it's muddied the waters.
Yeah, horribly, because it's made it so that on one level nobody, everybody believes it and nobody believes it. Everybody believes the weirdest crap, but nobody believes the stuff that just can actually happen. And I think that that's, to me, what was important in understanding about the Franklin scandal when I read Nick Bryant, because he really concentrates not on the wild rumors, not on the crazy stuff, but he really focuses on, what the evidence shows. Where does it lead? There are a few places where it does lead to powerful people, and a few places where it does lead to law enforcement. But you would expect it to lead to those places because those, there have always been some people in politics or in law enforcement that have been involved in these kinds of things.
It's corruption. It's just simple. It's simple corruption.
Exactly. So none of that should surprise you, but all of the over the top stuff, like in Eyes Wide Shut, all of that stuff like that is not what he's concentrating on. As we were talking, I don't want to belabor this too much, but as we were talking, I suddenly remembered the whole story, that the whole subplots or set of subplots that you have in Twin Peaks, where you have this one girl who dies, this one girl who's murdered. But then what you find out in the course of the unwinding of that story, and then subsequent to that, later on in the return, is you find out that there are, in fact, the murder or disappearance of any young person, or the torture and killing of any person, as we were talking about earlier. Any of that stuff is pretty gross. Any of that stuff is pretty traumatic. But you find out that, in Twin Peaks, you've got two things that are going on. You have the human and sex trafficking and drug trafficking that's going on in Twin Peaks, but you also have other stuff. You know what I mean? You have Leland, who kills his daughter and has been having an incestuous relationship with her. But you also have Bob. Ironically, the other Bob, the not Bob Berdella, but Bob of the Black Lodge, who is the paranormal parasite. So, it's like on one level, you just have a father who's doing these horrible things, and his daughter is connected to this drug and sex trafficking sort of operation that's happening, between the border of Canada and the United States. But on the other hand, you also have this, I guess we would call it this evil supernatural element, because you know what? Even if you don't believe it, that's what it feels like.
Well, I wish Serfiel was here because he has actually seen Twin Peaks, and I have never. So,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, but I mean, those people who've seen Twin Peaks who hear this, they'll know what I'm talking about, because there's this, one at one point in the first series, the first version of Twin Peaks, after Leland is exposed as being the murderer of his daughter, and he's dying because
spoiler alert.
spoiler alert, because he's dying, and Bob has left his body and has physically injured him to the point where he can't live anymore in the process. But he forces Leland to relive and remember all the things he's done to his daughter, which is horrific to contemplate. And after all of this happens, there's this scene where, all the law enforcement guys are all together and they're talking, and the sheriff is saying, yeah, but all this stuff about Bob possessing him, this couldn't be true, right? I mean, Leland just had to have gone crazy, right? And Agent Cooper says, well, you tell me, is it more comforting to think that a father would sexually assault and murder his own daughter? Is that more comforting than believing that there is an evil spirit that possessed him? And that roams the earth and feeds parasitically off people and makes them do these things? I mean, you tell me, which makes you feel better?
Yeah.
And so
that's one thing that I wonder, is whether or not, like, we ascribe a lot of this stuff to demons, even though I just talked about, Bob being possibly demon possessed, whether or not that's just a coping mechanism for a lot of us.
Well, it might be, but to me, it doesn't have to be either or,
Right.
I mean, I think that part of the reason why, when the public are confronted with the possibility that this dark stuff happens around them, like there's a Bob Berdella, or there's a drug or sex trafficking ring around them or something, what ends up happening is one of the ways they do cope is that's part of the reason why all these conspiracies, extra stuff develops, about the satanic rituals and the cannibalism and stuff. I mean, some of that stuff does happen. There are people that do cannibalize other people, obviously, but usually it doesn't. But I think sometimes the reason why these rumors get started and become believable is because the simple reality is also horrific. It's also horrific. And I mean, I guess the part of the reason why I ended up writing my experiences in a horror story is because that's sort of a horror I have to live with.
Right. Being exposed to all this, and being exposed to this guy. Professor WHAM, I have to tell you, this has been a pretty amazing interview of talking to somebody that was, like, pretty close to a serial killer. I don't think that, like, there's very many people that get to talk about this, and I'm really happy that you wanted to talk about it on this show in particular.
Well, yeah, I'm happy that I'm very happy that you permitted me to do so. We didn't get so much into the Chapel Perilous as I wanted to.
Well, let's get into that. What type of Chapel Perilous did you get into because of this?
Well, part of it is because, when you think about these things and you're traumatized by them, you start to wonder about your ability to perceive reality correctly. And
I can understand that.
And you begin to wonder whether you can trust your own perceptions of things and your own perceptions of people, or even of yourself. And I went through a period of my life where I thought that, well, if it was possible for me to, maybe part of the reason why, and this is what I was studying, this whole serial killer thing, trying to figure it out. I mean, I can certainly kind of understand. It's like I say in the story, I can kind of grok how a person could get to a place. And this is just intellectually. I've never gone there emotionally, okay? But intellectually, I can kind of get to a place where I can kind of grok that murdering someone might make a kind of sense, with a certain turn of logic. You'd have to be in a certain frame of mind. You'd have to have a certain kind of emotional crisis going on. You'd have to have a certain kind of desperation or sense of powerlessness. But I have certainly felt powerless. There was a time in my life when, I was abused physically and sexually by my father. And so there was a time in my life when I was young, when I wanted to kill my father because I was so angry at him. I was so angry at what I felt he had done to me. And I was so angry by how trapped I felt, that I felt like, if there was any way I could kill him, I would. But I was younger, and then ultimately, obviously, I didn't want to really kill anybody. I just wanted the pain to stop, so, but, so on a certain kind of intellectual level, I could sort of grok why a person might go to that lengths or be driven to that place out of a sense of desperation or passion, perhaps. So I began to think, well, maybe if I can go there, maybe if I can kind of understand that, maybe that means that I'm sort of bad like these people. Maybe there's some part of me that is just, kind of dark and evil too. And so I thought that way of myself. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't harm anyone, or, I just felt really bad about myself for a while.
Yeah, I can understand that. Right.
And, and also the fact that, I could sort of deal with his darkness. I could sort of, now I know it's because I grew up in such an abnormal situation that I just kind of have a high tolerance for weird and abnormal. And I don't necessarily think that, like I said, because someone is screwed up, that they're a serial killer. So, but because I thought I was so a terrible person, I felt like I should be punished. And so I lived for many years of my life. I lived in a world where I was punished all the time. I would sort of create things, like I would create accidents for myself, or I would create illnesses for myself. And these were ways of punishing myself because I felt like I needed to be punished. I'd also been raised to be punished. My father, one of the things my father told me when I was young was that he thought that I consorted with demons. Mm. And so, and that he could see the spirits moving in and out of my room, which always pissed me off because it was like, I can't see him. So like, why can you see him? But, but I was also devastated by that, obviously. And so it was like, I already sort of had that idea that there was something wrong with me. So I created a lot of really weird psychic situations in my life and was really paranoid. And so because what the Chapel Perilous is really about is not being able to tell if something is really paranormally happening or whether you're creating it somehow or reading into it. You know what I mean? It's sort of like the self-perpetuating prophecy. That you become that, your life becomes that. Sometimes I think that that's what, like, at least for some people, what a lot of Men in Black situations are, not all of them necessarily, but some of them. Like, for example, one of the things that happened in my life is I went through a period of like 6 years where for 6 years in a row in different places where I lived, I was in a tornado, which is bizarre. I mean, even in Kansas, what are the odds of that? And obviously I didn't get hurt or anything, but it was just like, at some point I was like, what is this tornado business? You know what I mean? or I would just have these weird experiences. I mean, if I were to like log all of my weird, bizarre experiences for people, they'd be just like, what is wrong with you? And that's what I mean by Chapel Perilous. Now I know that some of that was because I believed I deserved it. I believed I needed to be scared all the time.
And did you come out of it?
Yes, I have largely come out of it. And that happened, let's see, it's only started happening it happened once I moved to New York, actually. We moved away from Kansas City, the place of my haunting. But even because I started to spiritually grow in different ways. And probably the most important thing that I took up, I mean, Sufism has been an important component of that, actually. But also getting away from an environment or purposely putting myself into environments where I had to practice different kinds of thinking and different kinds of emotional structures.
Yeah.
I started doing something that's called Rasa Yoga, which is a yoga you use with your emotions. And I mean, it's not like it's a miracle, but it helped a lot. And then I've also done a couple of other healing modalities that I've worked with that have helped a lot. But there is something to that whole Chapel Perilous thing. And I can tell when my mind is starting to sort of drift into those places again. I can feel it, and it's like, no, can't go back there, because the truth is that if you're a normal person and you don't have like a psychological problem, like a physiological psychological problem, like a chemical problem, you can actually change how you think.
Yeah, I understand that because I've been there. I've been through my own Chapel Perilous. Probably for like 2 years ago, I went through my own kind of thing. So I totally understand where you're coming from.
And you just have to make a decision that you're not gonna go here anymore.
Right.
You're not gonna do this anymore.
Right. I think I'm reaching that point now, actually. Well, Professor WHAM, this has been incredible. I have really enjoyed speaking to you about this. Please tell everybody where they can find like your writings and the short stories that you have written. One of which is about this experience.
You can go to my website, professorwham.com, and the WHAM is WHAM, so it's professorwham.com. And both the books that I have readily available are advertised on that website. Not only this is the story. It's called Head Dreams, I believe, and it's in a small collection of Lovecraftian sort of stories called Final Season, a Lovecraftian Quartet. And then I've also written another book, A Mysterious Beauty, Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley, which is what we talked about previously.
Right. We talked about that last time. All right. Well, it's been awesome having you on. Please stay on the line with us. Guys, I will be back to close out this episode on Conspirinormal. All right, guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal. Very interesting interview with Professor WHAM there about Bob Berdella and her relationship with him. I mean, there was some interesting personal stuff that was really related in that interview, and I'm hoping that it's all going to come across. Probably one of the best shows that I have really done. Some interesting personal perspectives, and the only person that I can really think of that has, been in such proximity to a serial killer. So that there were a lot of questions. Thank you guys for tuning in. As usual, the usual spiel. If you guys are interested in going to the Patreon, please subscribe to us at patreon.com/Conspirinormal. There's a lot of things there. Going back all the way to the end of 2016, you guys can find for $5 a month, plenty of material to go back and listen to that will take you some time. So please check that out. Also, tickets to the Strange Realities Conference are now available. That is going to be linked up to the website and also to the show notes. You guys can find that there. I'm going to link that to the strangerealitiesconference.com website pretty soon, so where you guys can actually find tickets. That is going to be a hybrid event coming up October 15th through 17th of 2021, and we are really looking forward to it, guys. So please check that out. Attend either way you can, either by coming to Nashville at SIR Nashville or being there virtually. All right, that's it, guys. Next week, we're going to be doing something called the Conspirinormal Campfire with our friends from the Uniwatch crowd. We are going to be doing that. That is something that my cousin Jason Von Stein is going to be putting on, and we're going to be talking to him. And Steve Stockton will also be joining us on that show. And Surfio will be back as well. So join us next time. Goodness on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.